aside from the change in the artwork, you can't really tell very much that it's taken close to 30 years to write the next chapter here. Certainly, writing conventions have changed in that we don't see the same text boxes that we would have seen in the chapters which were released in the 70s and the 80s, but the characters all feel the same. So, in other words, you don't reach this new chapter and say, oh, I don't recognize these characters anymore. It feels just like two of the original three picked up from where they left off. You can really tell that this story was important to them. It always stayed in the back of their minds. So that's what really appealed to me about this story. Now, in terms of the changes, the rotating creative duties on this series. So, in the beginning, Richard Cumley was scripting the story with input, of course, from Saint-Aubin and Freeman. And so Saint-Aubin and Freeman were, of course, producing the art. It was Mr. Saint-Aubin penciling, perhaps inking too, and then George Freeman adding the... No, actually, sorry, I'm looking at one of the early chapters here. It's Jean-Claude Saint-Aubin, art and color and lettering, and George Freeman was editing. And then, of course, by the midway point, that would change to the crew. Sorry, just put you on pause so you don't have to hear all the page flipping here. Here's where it gets really interesting. For the 5th and 6th chapters, it appears that Mr. Cumley is off of the story, perhaps because he was focused on the main Captain Canuck feature, although I imagine he was still adding some ideas in the background. But the plot for the 5th and 6th chapters are credited to George Freeman and Jean-Claude Saint-Aubin, but a scripting credit is given to Jacqueline, and she was, or perhaps still is, Mr. Saint-Aubin's wife. Apparently, prior to chapter 5, she was adding some ideas, but starting with chapter 5, she got an official script credit. And then Mr. Saint-Aubin was still providing the art while Mr. Freeman was the editor on the title. And then when you get to that 7th chapter, which was written somewhere in 2014 or 2015, according to the foreword, Mr. Cumley wrote that chapter and Mr. Freeman provided the art. And that's where you can see a real change in the art, because Mr. Freeman and Saint-Aubin have always had very distinct art styles. They work well together, but you can clearly tell when the artwork is from Mr. Saint-Aubin and when the artwork is by Mr. Freeman. In fact, I'm thinking of a friend and fellow podcaster Mike Myers, who once talked about, I want to say it was issue number 0 of All New Classic Captain Canuck, and the art there was provided by George Freeman, and Mike pointed out that he observed that Mr. Freeman's art looked very much like early John Byrne artwork, and I can actually kind of see the parallels there. Again, both men's art styles are really good. I'm more in favor of Mr. Freeman's artwork, but I mean, that's just my personal taste. Even though it's a different art style and more modern penciling and inking and coloring techniques are used on this final chapter, the story still reads very well. And that's because you've got two of the original 3 members of the crew working on this story. Actually, maybe in a way it's good that there was an art change, because you can see with this chapter that there's uh, bringing to a conclusion of the original arc while setting this up for the next arc. So kind of a nice way of making that transition and setting things up for the future. I'd really love to know if Mr. Saint-Aubin simply wasn't available due to timing issues to be on this, or whether he contributed some ideas and said, you know what, you don't have to credit me with this here. Um, who knows? Um, but look at the chapters prior to that. Uh, Nothing here feels disconnected in terms of story. Again, sending home the point that all three men in the beginning were equally invested in this, and you can tell that they had a really good time sharing their ideas. The character development, the plot developments are all very consistent. There are times where according to one website which I read, it might seem a little too over the top, but nothing feels disjointed about this series. Even when Jacqueline Saint-Aubin comes on scripting, the characters all still sound the same way. They relate to each other the same way. So I'm really hoping that at some point down the line, Mr. Saint-Aubin, Freeman, and Cumley can come together and write a second arc. I mean, now I really want to know, where is Medan, and how are they going to go about getting it back? Plus, given what's gone on in the final pages of this first trade, I really want to see what happens between a couple of these characters in particular. There's a lot of great setup in here. My fear is that we may not see this anytime soon, though, and I think that's because of how Chapter House has grown over the years. When Chapter House Comics first started out, it was a new home for Captain Canuck, and so Fadi Hakim bought up the intellectual property rights to all the Captain Canuck material, which would allow him and Chapter House to reprint things like Beyond, Captain Canuck Unholy War. I know once upon a time there was a hope of reprinting Captain Canuck Reborn. Northgard was picked up pretty quickly, and there was the attempt to release all of the original Northgard material to go alongside the current ongoing. But now you look at it 4 years later, and Chapter House is growing in such a way that the focus really is on all new material. Of course, Pitiful Human Lizard has been there from early on, but that book has really picked up and become an important part of the Chapter House family of comics. But there are all of these new series with new stories going on that I don't know if there's much room at Chapter House now to continue in reprinting old material. And so I just fear that something like Beyond may be something that's on more of the back burner. Oh my, excuse me. But hopefully, enough people will listen to this show. Enough people will try picking this up in print or in digital, and then let Chapter House Comics know that they really enjoyed reading the story from yesteryear, and that they'd like to see this story continue to play out in future story arcs. I think that the original creators, I would hope they would be delighted to hear some positive fan feedback, and then look towards continuing this story. So there you have it. Beyond, the Quest for Medan, reprinted through Chapter House Comics. Okay, folks. For episode number 121, I'll be returning to my Spectre Spotlight series, this time looking at the Spectre's development, publication history for the Silver Age of DC Comics. But before that, I'm going to be releasing a very special mini episode in which I've got an important announcement about something that's coming up for me in the future. The show is not dying. I'm not pod fading. But there is something that I want to let all of you, my friends and listeners, know about. Because as a teacher, I like to give my students as much heads up about upcoming events as possible. And I just like to do that as a person in general. Let folks know what they can look forward to from Brian J. Rygate in the weeks and months ahead. So, in the meantime, if you want to get in touch with me, you can contact me at comicsandhistory@gmail.com, or you can go on over to Facebook, click like, so that you can receive regular updates about upcoming show releases. And stay tuned for that mini episode coming your way in hopefully 7 days from now. Until we meet again over the airwaves, folks, this class is dismissed.